It's safe to say that this is one of the most fascinating and mysterious pieces of fabric in the entire world. Our guest is here to talk about it now. He has been researching and lecturing on the Shroud of Turin, the topic of our discussion here, for over 30 years. He's a longtime member of the Shroud Science Group, president and founder of the Shroud of Turin Education Project. He's appeared on several nationally televised documentaries and most recently spoke about it on national television on Good Friday of 2013, on Good Morning America and World News Tonight with Diane Sawyer. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Russ Breault
Thank
to
you.
the Prophecy Summit at Pikes Peak.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
It would be easy to assume that most people are familiar with the Shroud of Turin and what it is, but for those who aren't, give us a summary. What is it that makes this more than just a piece of cloth?
Well, you have a 14-foot-long linen cloth. It bears the faint image of a bearded, crucified man, front and back image of a man who appears to be about 5'10". It bears all of the markings of the crucifixion as recorded in the gospel: a crown of thorns, a wound, scourging all over the back, wound in the side, nail wounds in the wrist, nail wounds in the feet. It's the most analyzed artifact in the world. It's been subjected to thousands of hours of scientific analysis. And the either-or proposition with the shroud is, could this be the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, or is it nothing more than some kind of a medieval hoax? Now, if it's ostensibly the work of an artist, then there must be some kind of substances on the cloth to account for the image as well as the blood stain. So is there any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain? What's on the cloth? Is the blood blood, or is it animal blood? Is it paint? Is it human blood? Is it blood from wounds? Well, again, in 1978, a team of scientists, 24 scientists, 40 members of the entire team, went over and had 5 days with the cloth, 122 hours access with it, brought over all kinds of gear, spectroscopy and X-ray radiography, infrared thermography, and photomicroscopy, and their conclusion was, it's not the work of an artist. There is no visible trace of any artistic substance on the cloth to account for the image, and the blood is blood. AB blood type. In 1995, we determined that it had human male DNA. And it's blood from actual wounds. It's not just painted blood. It's blood from what we see on the cloth is the exudate of wounds from a man who died upright in a position of crucifixion. And so the medical forensics, the forensic pathologists have weighed in, the blood chemists, the image specialists, and saying, looks like it could be authentic. And of course, that's my position on the shroud, is that I'm not going to make any pronouncements that this is in fact the burial shroud of Jesus, because you can't make that statement scientifically. Because at the end of the day, we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up with something we might extract from the shroud. Right. But you can eliminate all the alternatives, and you really only come away with one conclusion. It's probably authentic. And
now, what's the chain of evidence, to borrow a phrase from CSI? What's the chain of evidence? I mean, you mentioned the word medieval, medieval hoax, which is one of the charges leveled by skeptics.
Right.
Where was the shroud discovered, or when did it come to light, and what do we know about its history prior to the Middle Ages?
Well, it first appears, it has a fully documented history in Western Europe, beginning around 1353, and when it shows up in Loire, France, and so there are some that would say, well, it's the work of Leonardo da Vinci. Well, that's nonsense, because Leonardo wasn't born for 100 years later, around 1450. But then we also know that the cloth was in Constantinople for several hundred years and was stolen during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. And it kind of goes into hiding for about 150 years and then reappears in Loire, France in 1353. Now, this cloth that was in Constantinople that was stolen in 1204, that has a documented history all the way back to the 6th century. And prior to the 6th century, now you're getting into legends and folklore, and, you know, the history can get a little sketchy. But you actually have what's interesting is you have the legend of King Abgar, this is written up in the on the historical writings of Eusebius, who was the official church historian for the Emperor Constantine. So this is written, circa 4th century, and it talks about Abgar being the king of the city-state of Edessa, which is today would be in southern Turkey. Then it was its own separate city-state, and about 200 miles from Jerusalem. And the story goes is that Abgar was dying of leprosy, and so he sends a messenger down to Jerusalem to find Jesus and request that he come to Edessa to bring healing to him. Well, obviously Jesus had other plans, right? So the story goes is that this messenger then returns to Edessa with a cloth with a mysterious image on it, and Abgar beholds the image and he's healed of leprosy. Well, along with the messenger comes Jude Thaddeus, one of the 12 apostles, wrote the book of Jude, and he evangelizes the city as well. And so legend and folklore goes all the way back to 1st century, where a cloth with an image on it, a mysterious image, arrives in Edessa circa 1st century. And it's there until 944, taken to Constantinople, disappears in 1204, reappears 1353. This is the probable history, and it's interesting that the historical trail is corroborated with the pollen trail. That many pollens have been removed from the shroud. In fact, Avinoam Danin, he's the leading botanist in Israel. He's written 7 books on the flora of Palestine, based on the pollen as well as the flower images that appear to be on the cloth. He'll tell you that he believes that the shroud originated in a 20 kilometer radius of Jerusalem. That's pretty specific. And he's not Christian. He's written 7 books on the flowers of Palestine. His last book is called The Botany of the Shroud.
Huh. So what kind of testing has been allowed? Now, the shroud is under the control of the Vatican, is it not?
It is now owned since 1983. It has been owned by the current living Pope.
Okay.
And prior to 1983, it was in private hands, owned by the Savoy family from 1450 until 1983. It's over 500 years. And all of the kings of Italy have all come out of the Savoy family. And then, but, after World War II, Italy was no longer a monarchy, became a republic. And then, so the last king of Italy, King Umberto II, he was exiled into Portugal. And before he died, before he passed away, he willed it to the current living Pope.
Okay. So what sort of testing has been allowed by the Vatican on the shroud?
Well, certainly the biggest battery of tests occurred in 1978, and it's and there now. Let me just explain something about the shroud, which your audience needs to know. This is that the shroud was on a fire in 1532. So you got 8 big gaping holes. You got patches. You got water stains from where the fire was put out. You got a whole pattern of blood stains on front image, dorsal image. Now, all these things will penetrate the cloth. You take the cloth, flip it over, you'll see all that on the other side. But the image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon. It penetrates only the top 2 microfibers of the cloth. Now you've got to wrap your head around this. Each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So this image penetrates less than 1% of a single thread. You take a razor blade and shave the surface of the cloth, that image disappears. And so you have one set of phenomenon that explains the blood stains. When it appears that this cloth has wrapped a corpse, that would explain direct contact with a corpse would explain the pattern of blood stains, but that doesn't explain the image. The image is some other mechanism, some other process, and it's because one of the unique qualities of the shroud image is that it contains distance information. In other words, there are areas on the cloth, image on the cloth that would not have been in direct contact with the cloth. separated perhaps by a millimeter or a couple centimeters. Image is still there, except lighter. Closer to the body, the darker the image. Farther from the body, the lighter the image. Distance information. This tells you that the image is not a direct contact process, because if it was, if the cloth was separated from the body, there'd be no image at all. Okay, and so this is a very intriguing aspect of the shroud that's have had a lot of people speculating. Gee, well, and yet another interesting thing about this is that there's no image under the blood. This is very important, because in the sequence of events, we know that the pattern of bloodstains got on the cloth first, then the image later. When later? Maybe 3 days later, and and so this very intriguing is that the whole the shroud seems to correlate with the pattern of events. Good Friday followed by Easter Sunday, and so this other image mechanism that we're looking for is very intriguing, and it does make one consider: is the image the result of the resurrection? We certainly understand that the pattern of bloodstains is the result of the crucifixion, but could the image be the result of the resurrection? And I would say, yeah, I think so.
From what we know of the history of the ancient Near East, specifically the world around Judea in the 1st century, and the methods used by the Romans to keep their subject populations under control. We know that crucifixion was a part of one of the weapons in their arsenal of keeping people in line. Why couldn't the shroud have been the image of someone crucified long after the 1st century, somewhere between, say, the time that it went to Edessa and the time that it eventually arrived in Turin?
Well, crucifixion was eliminated as a process of execution in the 4th century, and that was terminated by Constantine. So by around 323 or so, there were no more crucifixions. And so now it does pose this argument. Well, okay, fine. The cloth is from Israel based on the pollen, and it's old. And, it could be the shroud of anybody. No, thousands of people were crucified. How do you know it's Jesus? And so that does set up that interesting question. And so what we see on the shroud very uniquely is, most importantly, the crown of thorns. It was a singular mockery for the man who claimed to be king of the Jews. Getting a crown of thorns is not a routine of crucifixion. The other uniqueness is that we see a man who's been brutally scourged, 120 scourge marks on the body. Now, why? Now, usually they would just send you out to be, they would either scourge you and have you released as a form of punishment. Remember, that happened to Paul a couple times during the book of Acts, right? And so, or they would have you crucified. Now, they might lightly scourge you, but remember, the Romans expected those who were crucified to remain on the cross alive all day long, which is why Pontius Pilate was surprised that Jesus had died so quickly. I don't know why he was surprised. He had him scourged within an inch of his life. But why was Jesus scourged so badly? Because Pontius Pilate didn't think Jesus was guilty of a crime worthy of capital punishment. And you know the story. He sent him to King Herod first. Herod sent him back, tried to trade Barabbas. That didn't work. Finally, he had him scourged within an inch of his life, thinking that when this bloodied hulk of a man came walking back into the courtyard, that the people would say, well, okay, I guess that's enough. We don't have to kill him. It's not what happened, though. Right. So now we have a man who's brutally scourged and crucified. And we also know that when the soldiers came by, because they had to remove the bodies from the cross because the Sabbath was about to happen, and the scripture tells you that they had to break the legs of the two thieves on either side of the cross because they were still alive. You break the legs, break them with a large wooden mallet weighing about 15 pounds, shatter the bones underneath the knees. Can't stand on broken legs, die from asphyxia, the inability to breathe. But when they came to Jesus, they noticed he was already dead. Therefore, they did not break his legs. Instead, you know the story. They stabbed him in the side with a spear to make sure he was dead, and out flowed blood and water, according to John. And so so now we have a wound in the side as well, and there's blood pouring down from that side wound with a separation of blood and blood serum. We've already chemically proven that the clear areas in that blood stain is blood serum, and there's and on the dorsal image, when that body was taken down and laid on the ground, that blood puddled across the small of the back, and you can see that, and so there's a whole pattern of post-mortem blood flow across the small of the back where the body was laid down horizontal, and so there's no question that this man was dead, because this is clearly blood that flowed after death.
You talked about the image and the fact that the image of the man was not beneath the blood stain, so the image was created after the blood was released.
Right.
That the image only penetrates a couple of microfibers deep onto the cloth, and anyone who's seen a picture of the shroud knows that this is basically a negative image.
Right.
And not so you're not seeing a Caucasian figure. Basically, the figure is dark, and the areas that would normally be dark are light. What sort of tests have been done to determine the origin of the image? What might have caused it? And what theories are sort of fit the evidence? What are the best theories that fit the evidence?
Well, that's still a lot of theories being postulated on that. It just kind of depends on where people come from. If you're looking for a purely naturalistic explanation, then that's going to determine what you're willing to consider. All right?
Right, yeah.
And so if you're willing to consider what the Bible would clearly describe as a pretty much of a supernatural event, then that certainly opens up a whole lot of other possibilities. Now, I'll give you this. You're right. It's a negative image. And as the editors of National Geographic said, how could a medieval artist have produced a negative image, and why even bother to do so?
Sure.
600 more years or more before the invention of photography,
Yeah.
because it was photography that reveals the negative image, which was first photographed in 1898. And so we know that it's a negative image, has distance information encoded in it. It's just an amazingly superficial image. What could do that? Now, because one of the things is that the reason I love the Shroud so much is because it is completely scriptural. It lines up with Scripture 100%. So, having said that, if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves this question: what happened in the tomb? Now, interestingly, the greatest miracle of all, the one that really said that Jesus is indeed the Son of God, that he rose again from the dead, right? I mean, Paul makes belief in the resurrection a condition of salvation, right? In Romans 10:9, right? So this is a big event, and yet there's no eyewitnesses to it. And so if we're going to ask what happened to Jesus in the tomb, we have to do it through inference. So we have several scriptures. One is the Mount of Transfiguration, which happened before the crucifixion, right? You know the story. Peter, James, and John are down here. Jesus goes up to the top of a high hill, and it says his face was transfigured before them, and his clothes became as dazzling white, or white like light. Okay, so Jesus literally transformed into a being of light. Then, 4 to 5 years after the crucifixion, according to most scholars, when Jesus appears to Saul, who becomes Paul, right, in a blinding flash of light, so bright that Paul is blinded. He's thrown from his horse. He's blinded for 3 days. So this is after the crucifixion, 4 to 5 years later. And so, just piece those two events together. You would have to assume that the very split second that Jesus' soul came zooming back into that lifeless body, that there was probably an explosion of light and then gone. That's what I believe, based on Scripture. Now, what about the shroud? What does the shroud show? Now, we for years have been trying to figure out or try to replicate some aspect of the shroud using light, and we've been unsuccessful until 2011.
Oh.
Researchers in Europe using ultraviolet excimer lasers against a control sample of linen, a 40 nanosecond burst against a control sample of linen, achieves the same coloration that we see on the shroud and the same depth, penetrating to the depth of 1 to 2 microfibers. Now, this is very intriguing. A laser, right? So now that doesn't prove that the shroud was made by lasers, but this is the first time we've been able to replicate any aspect of the shroud using light. Now, this is a big discovery, and I'll tell you why. Because the best description of what happened to Jesus in the tomb comes from Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians 15, "Behold, I show you a mystery.
Yes.
We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. We will all be transformed. For that which is corruptible must put on incorruptible. That which is perishable must put on imperishable." So, but Paul's talking about our resurrection. And so, but obviously Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. So this is exactly what happened to Jesus in the tomb. In a flash, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, and now you've got a 40 nanosecond blast of a UV laser achieving the same thing. This is, I think, significant. And so, and so I think it does demonstrate that this cloth could have been produced by that flash of light.
Yeah, with the intensity of an ultraviolet laser.
And if you can imagine that, lasers going off over the entire, we can't even comprehend it.
Yeah.
It's.
A friend of ours has written a book about that particular moment called Earthquake Resurrection, which indicates what he thinks the result will be from that release of energy all at once. But your talks here at the Prophecy Summit at Pikes Peak, you describe the Shroud of Turin, or at least the title of one of your talks calls the Shroud of Turin a picture of the rapture. Is this what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Because remember, the message of the shroud is past, present, and future. It's very important. And for this is a prophecy conference, so we're obviously talking about the future here. And the next event on the church calendar is the rapture of the church. And so so this is one of the big messages of the shroud is because here this is a group of pretty conservative evangelicals, but go talk to some of your Methodist friends and your Presbyterian friends and your Episcopal friends and your Catholic friends. Do any of them believe in the rapture? No, they don't. And so this is important because the shroud stands as a testimony. Because let's get real cynical, okay? 1 Thessalonians 4. Most of your audience knows that verse, right? The Lord Himself shall descend with the trump of God and the voice of the archangel, and dead in Christ shall rise first, and then we who are alive who remain shall be caught up together with Him in the clouds, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Let's get cynical. Oh, come on. You really don't believe this, do you? You actually believe that at some point in the future, you're going to be transformed into a being of light and rocket up into the clouds and meet Jesus in the air? I'm telling you that the shroud stands as a testimony that these things are true. That's the message of the shroud. And I say, and I'll have it in my presentation, can you believe in the unbelievable? Because here, your audience certainly believes it, but there's a big, big swath of the church that doesn't.
That's true.
And when I talk about the message of the shroud being past, that's huge too, because it harkens back to a past event, the resurrection itself. As we said, Paul makes it a condition of salvation. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God has raised Him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. You got a lot of people walking around here that will say this. Well, why do I have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Why is that so important? Why can't I just believe that Jesus was a good man who did good things? And I'll tell you why. Here's the reason. Because a dead Jesus can offer you nothing. Only a Jesus who has risen from the dead, only a Jesus who has defeated the power of death, only that Jesus has the right, the authority, and the ability to offer you or me anything beyond this life. And so we have to start with the empty tomb. And certainly the shroud testifies to loud and clear to not just the crucifixion, that He died. Because remember, you got a lot of theories out there that maybe He survived and raised a family with Mary Magdalene, the crazy swoon
Da Vinci
theory.
Code theory.
Right.
Sure, right.
No. The shroud clearly tells you that this man is dead. And yet at the same time, you have this inexplicable image that says, this man's alive.
You're right. George Barna and the Barna Group has done yeoman's work, in my opinion, in tracking the beliefs of professing born-again Christians in the United States, and it is shocking when you begin reading how few of them actually accept some of the basic core tenets of Christianity, like the sinless life of Jesus, his literal death and resurrection, and things like that. But there is the people in America who claim to be born again represent only about 19% of the total population.
Right.
So we've got 80% of the people walking around at the grocery store, the Quickie Mart, at work, at the ball game, who actually accept any of what we read in Scripture. How do we use the Shroud of Turin to reach them?
One of my lectures here is called The Shroud of Turin, an Evangelical Opportunity. Certainly, it's most closely associated with the Catholic Church. And some people have a disconnect with that, and I say to people, well, look, it's not going to be a Baptist relic. It's been in France and Italy for 700 years. Of course, it's going to be associated with the Catholic Church, but it becomes an evangelical opportunity in this regard. I think I've been doing this for 30 years. People ask me, and it's so easy to witness about Christ when you're talking about the shroud. Oh, what are you into? What are you studying? Oh, the Shroud of Turin. What are you studying that for? Well, it's just one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the world. And I just think it's really cool. Let me tell you about it. Now, as you tell someone about the shroud, because it's a really cool mystery, right? What else are you talking about? You can't talk about the shroud without talking about Jesus, okay? And so a lot of people, there's a lot of people that are into apologetics, right? And the archaeological evidences that support the historical accuracy of the Bible, and all that's fine. But you know what? You can talk about apologetics all day and never talk about Jesus. You can't talk about the shroud and not talk about Jesus. It is the very bullseye of the faith, the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's what it is. In fact, there was a book written in the 1960s called The Fifth Gospel. Great book. Think, this is a gospel because it testifies to the very things that the four gospels do, right? Life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Except it's an image on a linen cloth. Speaks every language, doesn't need to be translated. That image, that iconic face image on the shroud, broadcast around the world, everyone knows what it is. Everybody knows what it is. Oh, that's Jesus. Or at least it's supposed to be Jesus, right? And so everybody knows that. Most of the icon images of Jesus that we become familiar with are all based on the shroud. Okay? And so you can't talk about, now, again, this book was called The Fifth Gospel. Very good book. Title was wrong. It's not the fifth gospel. It's the first gospel. Think about this. Gospel of John. Peter and John run to the tomb, see the linen cloth lying there, and believe that he had risen. The empty burial shroud is the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. The four Gospels, or the earliest gospel, probably the Gospel of Mark, wasn't written until at least 20 years later. So, anyways, I just think if I would encourage people to learn about the shroud, to kind of get interested in it, buy a book, buy a DVD, get educated about it, start learning about it, put a picture up somewhere, put a book out on a coffee table, and guess what? People will get intrigued by that and say, what is that? And again, my approach is simply this. I don't know if the shroud's authentic or not. I just think it could be. I think it probably is. But I always say people, especially in Protestant world, a lot of people always ask the wrong question. Here's the wrong question. They say, well, what if it's not authentic? And I say, wrong question. What if it is authentic and we did nothing with it? So is there this middle path that we can take that allows us to use the shroud for what it is, for its phenomenal witness, without having absolute proof of authenticity? And I'm sure there is. Absolutely. It's a mystery. In fact, this is one of the strongest points of argument for authenticity. Now think about this. If the shroud was an obvious work of art, we would have figured that out 100 years ago. But the fact that it remains a mystery after thousands of hours of investigation is the strongest argument for authenticity. Now, why do I say that? Because all the deep things of God are all mysteries. Every one of them. Can anyone get their head around the incarnation? Can anyone explain, okay, show me how the Word of God becomes flesh? Walk me through that. You can't. It's a mystery. Walk me through the resurrection. How did that happen? I mean, explain to me how Jesus just appeared in the upper room, though the doors were locked and the windows were closed, right? How does that happen? How do you feed 5,000 people with a boy's lunch? You can't explain that. It's a mystery. All the deep things of God are all mysteries, and the fact that the shroud remains a mystery, I think, is a fantastic testament to its authenticity.
What was it 30 years ago that attracted you to the shroud and began you on this course of study?
Well, I was in college. I was a writer for the college newspaper. The scientists had gone over there in '78. This was 1980. I'm dating myself now, and then was intrigued by it. I became a Christian in 1977, so I was pretty new in my faith. In '78, I started reading articles. What? You're kidding me? Scientists are going over to analyze a burial shot of Jesus? Does that even exist? I got real excited by this. And so in 1980, well, in June of '80, National Geographic came out with a big article about it. And so I asked if I could write some articles, so I did. I spent several months reading books, articles, calling some of the scientists on the phone to get some quotes. And so by the time the articles came out in the fall of 1980, I had all this information packed in my head. And so I'm said to myself, is that it? Am I done? I said, no way. This is really cool. And I'd say, so I came away with two conclusions, and that's this. The shroud is a phenomenal witness for Christ, and nobody knows anything about it. And so at that point, I was armed with an old slide projector and 12 slides from the Holy Shroud Guild. And I was attending a church, and I asked if I could do a little presentation because I just wanted to get out there and talk to somebody about this. And so they said, okay, why don't you go talk to the 8th grade boys? I said, okay, fine. And this is in December of 1980. Mm-hmm. I had about a dozen boys sitting cross-legged on the floor, big images on the screen, walking them through the whole passion of Jesus, and their eyeballs are as big as silver dollars. And I said, that's it. I knew what I had to do. And before you know it, I'm asked to do all these other Sunday schools. In 1981, not just all by word of mouth, I'm being asked to speak to about 60 different churches all over the Southeast. So here, all I did was write a couple articles. So I'm asked to stand up in front of an audience and be the expert. And I said, well, I better be an expert then. And so I read everything I could find in the English language, and I attended the first scientific symposium on the shroud. And this is when the STIRT project released their results in October of 1981. I attended that in London, Connecticut, and that's when I was able to meet a lot of scientists and historians and archaeologists and people that are involved in the shroud, and I've been involved ever since.
How is your work focusing on the Shroud of Turin affected relationships with family, personal relationships? I mean, oftentimes there's a cost to be paid, perhaps in people who you formerly associated with who just aren't ready to make that journey.
People respect what I do. They think it's interesting, even cool, because it is an interesting mystery whether you believe in it or not. Yeah. But I think I've had no pushback from family, but the shroud has opened many doors to witness to family, and it's in fact, one of my cousins went with me to that conference in 1981, and she became a believer through the whole process of the shroud, and she's a very, very strong believer now. And it's there's been thousands of people that have come to the Lord through this, and it's not that I would ever say that you need to place your faith in the shroud. Of course not. Of course not. The shroud just points the way. Mm-hmm. It just leads the way. Now, I have the very interesting is that all the time I ask myself why. Why has God preserved this thing? Why has God literally revealed it through science and technology, in the 20th and 21st centuries? And you think about the age we're in today, very skeptical age, an age that is becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity,
Yes.
but an age that communicates more today with images than it does with words. Isn't it interesting, then? Is it possible that God would preserve an image of his crucified and risen Son on an ancient linen cloth? See, one of the things I think of is this, that Joseph of Arimathea gave us a big clue. One of the interesting attributes of the shroud is the actual manufacture of the linen itself. It's made out of flax. It's a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern twill with a Z twist. Now, why is this significant? It's a very expensive piece of cloth, just the way that it was woven.
It would have been owned by a wealthy man.
Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth. But let's take that one step further. When the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies to make the sacrifice, he takes off his street clothes and puts on clothes made of fine, twisted linen, which represents the holiness of God. The curtains, all in the tabernacle in the wilderness and separating the outer court from the inner court and everything else, all were commanded to be made of fine, twisted linen, representing the holiness of God. Now, I think that when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both Pharisees, they had access to the temple. I believe this linen cloth was purchased from the temple store. It was linen that would have been suitable for a high priest about to enter the Holy of Holies. This is the message I think Joseph of Arimathea is sending us in the type of cloth that he purchased to wrap Jesus. That's what I think he's telling us. And it's interesting that Joseph is mentioned in all 4 Gospels.
Obviously, with 30 years of study compressed down to the half an hour or so that we've spent together, we've only scratched the surface here. Where do people go to find out more information about the work of the Shroud of Turin Education Project?
My principal website is shroudencounter.com.
Shroudencounter.com.
And I do lectures at colleges, a lot of churches. A Shroud Encounter is a full 90-minute soup to nuts presentation. Doesn't have to be 90, but 90 minutes is a great length. It moves like a movie. We're going to roll through about 200 images on the big screen, and it's a great way to do an outreach to the community. Because I'm always looking at the doubting Thomas. I'm always wanting that person who's sitting on the sidelines of faith, doesn't go to church, isn't that interested in organized religion, but you know what? That shroud, he's kind of interested in that. He's seen a couple documentaries on it, and he's intrigued by it, And if he comes to a Shroud encounter, it'll become a Christ encounter, because again, you can't talk about the shroud without talking about Jesus. And in the process of exploring whether or not the shroud could be authentic, guess what else we're going to do? We're going to walk through the passion, the resurrection, all the way down to doubting Thomas. And it's so it's a tremendous outreach.
Russ Breault, fascinating conversation.
Thank you
Honored
very
to meet
much.
you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Russ Breault is the founder and director of the Shroud Education Project from the Prophecy Summit at Pikes Peak. I'm Derek Gilbert.